Playing a video game and voting for Trump are two completely different things, right? Well, they might have more in common than you might think.
What do video games teach us about Trumpism? This is the University of the Netherlands.
Do you pay attention to how much information you give to big tech companies? And do you sometimes worry that Google and Facebook might know too much about you? Well, you're not alone. Many people feel too exposed and would like to control when and how they are perceived by others. I suggest to you that this desire is characteristic for our contemporary moment and that it is a desire for stealth, for being invisible, or more generally, imperceptible. I currently look at what I call the aesthetics of stealth in popular culture because I noticed a few years ago that this word stealth circulates a lot in the public sphere and attaches itself to lots of different and unexpected contexts. In this video, I would like to present some of these contexts to you. But first, take a look at this diagram, a so-called Google Ngram. This particular diagram shows you how often the word stealth was used in Google's English language corpus from 1940 to 2019. Notice what has happened since the 1970s. You can observe that the use of this word has considerably increased since that time. Why is this? Why has Western and Anglophone culture been so interested in stealth since that moment in time? And how does this relate, for instance, to questions of queer survival, but also Trumpism? These are some of the questions that I'd like to briefly address. Let's start at the beginning. The main reason for the initial uptake of the word stealth in the 1970s is that stealth was the codename of a US military project that worked on developing what we now call stealth planes, that is, planes that cannot be detected by radar. This technological innovation was necessary for budgetary reasons. The US government knew that the Soviet Union was massively outspending them on defense by about 50%. And so it was clear that fighting the enemy plane for plane had become too expensive. And so the US pursued a different approach. Instead of fighting the enemy plane for plane in open combat, they tried to create aircraft that can avoid open combat entirely because the enemy cannot even detect them. There's one important aspect that connects these planes to the media culture of our present, and that is digital technology. Stealth planes were the very first planes whose outer shell was designed and arguably could only be designed by means of digital technology. Because the calculations necessary to make a plane imperceptible to radar are so complex that engineers had to rely on the computational power of the digital. So digital technology has an extraordinary capacity to make things both perceptible and imperceptible. And we kind of know this from our everyday use of, say, Netflix. The Netflix interface registers and stores almost every little action we take when using Netflix. What we watch, when we watch it, but also for how long and at what point exactly we stop watching, and much, much more. Netflix then analyzes this data to extract patterns of behavior that we didn't even know we had. And this helps Netflix understand our user behavior in ways that, according to Cindy Holland, the former Netflix VP of original content, goes several layers deeper than more conventional ways of understanding user behavior, for instance, through genre preferences. So the Netflix algorithm knows all of this about us, but we don't know anything about it because, of course, the Netflix algorithm itself is black boxed. Netflix is a relatively harmless example compared to the data extraction practices of some big tech companies and some governments. But the overall point here is digital technology understands us in ways that go far beyond our own perceptual abilities. We don't really know how and how well digital technology prehends us and what will happen to the prehended information. Thus, digital technology comes to feel like a threat. We feel surveyed. And so, culturally speaking, stealth can be understood as a reaction against widespread digital surveillance. And as I said, it gets taken up in very different contexts. And I would now like to present a few examples from media culture to you to explore how stealth becomes a part of our cultural imagination. Let's first look at so-called stealth video games for a moment. Stealth games are games in which you have to accomplish a mission without ever being detected by the enemy. The aim is to be efficient yet imperceptible. You have to move like a panther or a ghost, as some of these games call it. Now, that's very different from so-called shooter games in which you do fight the enemy man for man in open combat. Shooter games oftentimes simulate more conventional scenarios of force-on-force combat. Now, let's look at an example of a stealth video game. This is a clip from Splinter Cell Blacklist, developed by Ubisoft's Toronto studio and released in 2013. This YouTube walkthrough is of the mission Border Crossing, in which the player has to obtain 3 intel files without being detected. If an enemy spots you in this particular mission, you immediately fail and have to restart at the beginning of the mission. So you have to play in total stealth. Notice how calm it is. There are no gunshots, bomb explosions, or any other combat noise. Instead, the player calmly analyzes the game space by moving the camera around to understand how this environment allows for efficient action without being spotted. So the player is looking for cover spots, and they're analyzing the movement patterns of the enemy guards and the directions that they look in by means of that little map in the bottom left. They also analyze the enemy's perceptual abilities. For instance, the sniper on the roof is more perceptive than regular guards. And all of these factors need to be considered in order to find openings in the environment, or what one could call affordances for staying out of sight. Before the player enters the back of the truck, they have to perfectly time the short interval in which the 4 enemy posts, including 1 sniper, do not look at the truck. This is the moment for stealth. And the player barely succeeds. The detection warning indicates that the sniper on the roof has almost identified a hostile individual on the premises. But, as they say, almost doesn't count. And so the player is safe after all. Stealth is about taking such well-calculated risks on the fly. It's about finding last-second solutions to shifting problems. So this short clip can help us understand some principles of stealth as it operates in our cultural imagination. Stealth is a survival tactic for a vulnerable individual in a hostile environment. And this tactic consists in looking at the surroundings as a complex network of elements. You constantly have to perceive how you are perceived from other points in the environment, but also how you can manipulate and shift that environment. Furthermore, we can see that this approach can be entirely non-lethal, so that one doesn't just protect oneself, but also leaves unharmed the world through which one moves. Now, I just said that stealth gameplay can be entirely non-lethal. And by the way, that's my favorite kind of stealth in a video game. Because it means that stealth is, at least potentially, peaceful. For my interpretation of stealth as part of our contemporary political culture, it is important that this kind of gameplay expresses very different values than, say, the gameplay of a first-person shooter. What are those values? I suggest to you that there is something queer about stealth, because it resists the normative assumptions that govern a certain environment. According to trans video game journalist Riley McLeod, stealth gameplay expresses values of what he calls a queer masculinity. In his article, The Queer Masculinity of Stealth Games, McLeod writes, "Stealth games let me cooperate with a situation. They ask me to take into account all the moving parts and my role in them. The way men behave in stealth games feels closer to what I hope my own masculinity is. Thoughtful, adaptable, aware of myself and my effect on the world around me. Shooter masculinities close off possibilities, make an enemy out of the world. Stealth masculinities place me firmly in the world and let me nurture it into something new. This idea of being mindful of the environment for the sake of minimizing harm is very important to my understanding of stealth. But let's not forget that stealth is first and foremost a protective strategy and a survival strategy for queer people, and especially for trans people. Many trans people choose to pass as cisgendered to protect themselves against violence. And in the trans community, this form of passing is called going stealth. In his book, Going Stealth, scholar Toby Beauchamp explains that this expression is used by many transgender-identified people to describe non-disclosure of transgender status. Going stealth is a tactic for escaping state surveillance or persecution, Beauchamp says. And by the way, you can get first-hand testimony on this in the recent Netflix documentary Disclosure, where the actresses Sandra Caldwell and Laverne Cox talk about how, quote, living stealth was the way to survive. So, having to go under the radar and hide one's identity can cause harm and suffering. And in my research, I try to evaluate these various and contrasting aspects of stealth. So far, I have discussed practices of stealth, either simulated in a video game or the lived experience of going stealth as a survival tactic. But stealth also plays an important role in contemporary culture because it is used as a discursive weapon. Simply put, people talk about stealth for their own political ends. And I would like to give you two brief examples of that. In 2020, the Trump administration repeatedly emphasized that the novel coronavirus was a stealth virus, an invisible enemy. What's the point of this rhetoric? Well, the label stealth virus is actually used by medical experts to refer to the now well-known fact that those who carry the coronavirus are highly contagious before they show any signs or symptoms of disease. But the rhetoric of the Trump administration insinuated more than that. Designating the virus as an enemy thoroughly casts it as an external threat. The virus's intrusion into US territory becomes a willful act of attack rather than a matter of the biological reproduction of a pathogen within a highly dense and a highly mobile population of human beings. And especially in combination with the label Chinese virus, this rhetoric also racializes the coronavirus in a way that taps into old and new strategies of anti-Chinese fear-mongering. So here, the expression stealth virus is abused to insinuate some kind of conspiracy. Now, compare this to the way in which Fox News evoked the uncertain importance of stealth voters during the 2020 presidential campaign.
And now for something else. Could so-called secret voters be the key to President Trump's re-election? One study found 53% of stealth voters backed President Trump in 2016, but didn't tell anybody, especially not the pollsters.
This news item is the result of Fox News' shallow dive into a communication science paper, which shows that people who voted for Trump back in 2016 were considerably more likely to lie about it in polls, compared to people who voted for Hillary Clinton or a third party. Well, who's surprised? But it's interesting to me that this news item uses the notion of stealth to spin the overwhelming majority of Trump voters among 2016 stealth voters into a hopeful tale suggesting that Trump has lots of secret supporters and might still win the election, regardless of what those annoying polls say. Well, as we know, stealth voters did not help Trump win re-election. But these two examples illustrate the contrast between the different uses of stealth talk. On the one hand, we saw that the coronavirus was cloaked in stealth to conjure the image of a reprehensible foreign enemy. And on the other hand, stealth voters are evoked to make people believe that their partisan in-group of Trump voters was larger than it actually was. So stealth talk can be used as an accusation against political adversaries and as a reassuring tale to create and maintain in-group solidarity. Stealth is a nimble middle term that spells both community and conspiracy. So, what does stealth tell us about contemporary political culture, including Trumpism? The discourses of stealth, or what I called stealth talk, exploit a general distrust of the public sphere and suggest that political power lies in secrecy and deception. Can we even believe anymore what we're being told about viruses and voters? Those politicians are telling us whatever they want. So stealth talk is also connected to conspiracy thinking. In the practices of stealth, such as in video games or in real life, we saw that the entire environment becomes a problem or a puzzle to be solved. How can one remain unperceived? One wrong step and the world turns on you, turns phobic. So in this era of digital surveillance, stealth is also about how we manage how we are being perceived by others. Stealth is about managing one's image, or as I would say, stealth is about managing oneself understood as an image. Thanks for listening.